According to a new report by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, schools are collecting and storing kids' names, birth dates, browsing histories, location data, and much more without proper privacy protections. Joining us to talk about what's in this new report and what parents, guardians, and educators can do is Amul Kalia from the EFF. Welcome to the show, Amul.
Thank you for having me.
So last week, a Republican congressman got a lot of flack for saying, in reference to privacy changes, that nobody had to use the internet. And not only do most students in public schools have to use the internet, they also now have to sign up for cloud services. More and more students are getting school-issued laptops and tablets, and they're being required to sign up for services like G Suite for Education. I know you talked to a lot of students, parents, and educators. What were their biggest concerns about their privacy in schools right now?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. And yeah, that comment from Representative Sensenbrenner, I don't know where that came from. Have you tried not using the internet? Anyway, getting back on topic. So yeah, schools across the country, whether they're public or private, are rapidly deploying educational technology in our classrooms. And what we've found in the majority of the situations, they're actually doing it without proper consideration for student privacy and security. And this is likely to continue to be a problem as EdTech is actually projected to continue to gain ground. So we hear from different stakeholders, we hear from parents, we hear from administrators, and we hear from students themselves as well. So I think the biggest group that we have heard from is parents, our parents. Their concern kind of range from, they just don't know how to proceed. They're given these sorts of documents and they have, 3 days to review them. And in that time, they're supposed to get back to the school. Okay, I agree with this. And a lot of times the documents actually don't provide all the information that they need to see whether or not they should allow their child to be, allowed to use these new technologies. They're concerned about what kind of data these EdTech companies and applications are collecting and what companies are doing with that data. And, particularly for non-educational and commercial purposes, for instance, product improvement, a lot of these times like vaguely defined and parents just don't know what that entails and what they can do to protect their kids' privacy. And there's just not enough informed consent for companies to be able to do some of the things that they're able to do with these policies.
So what options do parents have? I mean, you said, get back to us in 3 days. Is there ever an option to opt out of these services?
Yeah. So parents have a lot of power. It's just that a lot of times they just don't know how to exercise it. Which is something that we kind of mentioned in our report that we published. Parents should find ways to gain allies locally. I think if you go to a PTA meeting and if you speak up, you're more than likely to find a few other people who will be like, oh yeah, that person's making good points. Like I want to go ahead and, join up with them. A lot of the ways that it works is like, gather a few group of parents and go to the school administrator or go to the school board president, the elected representatives, because they are accountable to you. And demand those opt-outs. Generally, we've found that opt-outs are very rare. We want them to be more of a thing because rightfully so, parents are concerned and their concern should be addressed. Opt-outs can take many forms. Some of them could be using an alternative device. For instance, we heard of a parent who didn't want their child to use a Chromebook, but they were okay with an iPad being used because they were much more comfortable with the privacy policy that Apple had put forward. It could also just include another form of opt-out could just be like not using any educational technology at all without harming their students' education, without harming their child's education. So, there could also be, basically schools making sure that there are plenty of other options without actually impacting the education that the child is receiving. So opt-outs can take many forms and we want to see more of them.
Who's the right person to talk to about all this kind of stuff? Because when I think about when I think of privacy and security online, for even those who are firmly entrenched in the security or in the internet, technology world, it can be very confusing. And then you take an organization like education, for example, or the classroom, and I mean there are these tools that are very powerful potentially in protecting the security and privacy of the students, let's say. But I mean, is it the teachers that are supposed to know, like have the information as far as being kind of transparent as far as what information they're collecting or how they're protecting the students, or does it go higher than that?
I think so. In our report, we actually go ahead and address all the stakeholders that we find in the educational ecosystem. So we address the school district administrators, we address the EdTech companies, and we address the teachers themselves. And we also addressed librarians and sysadmins. And, basically we were going through the list of all the people who are part of this ecosystem. And in terms of teachers, they definitely do have a role. A lot of times we find, not a lot of times, but there were cases where we found out that teachers were actually adding students or enrolling students in these technologies without actually consulting with their parents or without actually telling the districts, which we think is a big no-no. Especially because in that instance, you're basically just taking the service provider's privacy policy at face value without actually doing any critical analysis of it or making sure that your district is okay with it. And speaking of districts, I think they are the people who actually have the most power in this situation. What districts can demand from service providers is rather than signing standard contracts that they're offered, but rather making sure that they get customized one that actually addresses their concern. For instance, if they have parents who care about privacy, which of course it's all of them, they should demand contracts that actually address their particular situation and actually spell out all the things that the data can be used for. They have a lot of buying power. These devices are cheap, but the edtech providers still need the district to deploy them. And they need to use this power to make sure that we're able to preserve student privacy.
What's one of the biggest ironies to me is that you can't sign up for a Gmail address until you're 13 years old. Like, you would, as a parent, if you wanted to get a Gmail address for your child, you'd have to lie and say, that they were 13. But yet, my 12-year-old twins got a Gmail address without my permission. There wasn't, it was just through the school. It has, the ending of the school they go to, and they're told they can only use it for school purposes. But it's just like where like one hand isn't looking at the other. It seems like very ironic.
Yeah, no, that's actually a problem that we raised in the report as well. It's parents should know, like transparency is actually a very big topic in student privacy. A lot of times parents find out that their children have been signed up for these services without actually consulting them, without them actually getting adequate notice. So this is actually a pretty big problem. And we hope that school districts take positive steps to make sure that it actually doesn't happen. And yeah, it's pretty shocking that your kids are signed up for these services without you actually having had a chance to vet those privacy policies and see what kind of deal that the district has with the service provider. So yeah, that's shocking.
And then, I mean, even outside of the classroom, it was just a couple of weeks ago that Google announced Family Link, which is essentially a way of opening accounts for children under 13, kind of in a more official sense. But this is controlled by the parents, let's say. Does that potentially introduce, I don't know, some of these tracking concerns that you're talking about in this report, but in the home? I mean, there's reasons that for the longest time, I think because of the COPA rules, children under 13 weren't allowed to. Why is that different?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the Family Link program, so I can't comment too much on that. But we did find that by default in the Google education accounts, the G Suite for education accounts that students were being signed up for, by default settings, there was this thing called Chrome Sync that was enabled by default. And that was actually like, collecting a lot of the data. And Google said that this doesn't have to be enabled by default, but we found out that a lot of the schools weren't actually taking the steps that's required to actually going ahead and disabling it. Mm-hmm. And that's actually still one of our biggest points of contention with Google in Chromebooks that are being deployed for education. They say that, we're not using any of this information for advertising purposes, but what they don't say is that we're not collecting any of this information. So I think that's like the nuanced difference. So them saying like, we're not collecting this information for advertising process, but we want them to say we're not collecting this information.
So, I mean, I know there are lots of parents who work for Google who are also concerned about their children's privacy and parents that work for other services like this. Is there any self-regulation going on within the industry?
Yeah, there is actually. So there's this thing called the Student Privacy Pledge. It's led by two organizations, which is the Future of Privacy Forum and the Software Information Industry Association, or SIAA, if you're fancy. So what the problem with this particular Student Privacy Pledge is, it's how broad the definitions are. For instance, it says that student personal information, the way that it's defined in the pledge, is to allow sensitive information to be collected as long as it's not linked to a student's personally identifiable information. And we think that that's problematic because this can potentially allow them to, okay, students are looking at, I mean, this is an extreme example, but they're looking at, sexual health sort of issues. And, a lot of times that's something that you do in private, especially if you're a curious young mind. And we don't want to see a system where students are essentially okay with this idea of this data that's being collected on them by companies. So we're like teaching them to be okay with spying at a very young age. And another problem that I would like to point out with the Student Privacy Pledge is that its definitions are actually way narrower than FERPA, which is the federal law that sort of dictates how student information is collected. And that's crazy because, as we know, we at EFF especially, because we're suing the government, that they're not exactly known for protecting our privacy. So it's ironic that a federal law is actually more protective of student privacy than this self-regulatory sort of student privacy pledge that a lot of these edtech providers are signing on to.
So we talked a little bit about what parents can do, what teachers can do. What can students do? If students often lead the way, they sometimes know more about privacy than maybe their teachers. What can they do to help ensure their privacy?
Yeah, I think students definitely have a unique role because they're the people who are affected by these technologies that are being deployed. So I think one of the biggest things that we find is that there's a huge sort of desire amongst the students to just kind of fit in and not cause any trouble. We've seen, I talked to one of the students who she was particularly concerned, but she also saw that none of her classmates actually cared about this stuff. And she's a high school student actually in Mountain View. But simultaneously, this is something that she had an issue with, but she went ahead and she's like, okay, I'm just going to do it. But, it's with those situations, what students can do is they can actually communicate and talk to their peers. And more importantly, I think they should talk to their parents about it whenever they have these concerns. They need to say, like, I'm being signed up for this service. I don't like it. Or, especially if they're not able to parse out all the privacy policies, what they say, which, as an adult, even I sometimes have trouble parsing those out. Mm-hmm. So they should communicate to their parents, be like, hey, this is what I'm being signed up for. What can I do? They can also talk to their teachers. What is this service you're enrolling me for? Have you talked to my parents? Have they consented to this? They can talk to their school administrators. So they have lots of steps, but I think the primary way that they can sort of take action is to, making sure that their parents are informed. And whenever they feel uncomfortable, we think that they should speak up.
Amul, thank you so much for joining us. Amul Kalia is a staff member at the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and is at Amulionaire on Twitter.
Amulionaire.
I love it. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You too.
You too. Have a good night.